Nathaniel and his brother sat in near silence at the top of their tree stand about 20 feet into the air. It was fall, early in the elk season, and the pair had come to Kootenai National Forest near the Cabinet Mountains to bring down his brother Troy's first bull. Nate was 5 years older than Troy, who had just turned 21 and hadn't been much of a hunter in his youth, unlike Nate. Troy was usually timid, but in the last 2 years he had shown interest in hunting, likely to get away from our parents more often while he was in college. He was surprisingly good with his guns, despite his lack of experience, and Nate had watched him down a buck nearly 300 yards out. In the end, Troy had liked hunting more than he thought he would, and had joined Nate on various hunts from things as small as ducks all the way up to bear hunting during last year's season. Now, the goal of this trip was to get Troy to bring down his first elk. They had already been here for 2 days and had no such luck. They had heard the calls in the distance and had attempted to use a cow call to lure them in, but still, nothing. So, here they were, so early in the morning of the third day that it was still dark outside. Nate had woken up first around 4:30, as he usually does on hunts, before he woke up Troy, and they both prepared and climbed the stand. From up here, they could see for quite some distance, and he could also see a campfire at least a couple miles away in the distance, another group either camping or hunting up in this more rugged terrain. Even from this distance, their fire was surprisingly bright, as if someone was still awake and keeping it going. Nate turned away from there and looked around, hoping to see any sign of their quarry, but nothing moved in the darkness. They likely wouldn't see anything until it got a bit brighter, if at all. They weren't exactly here for night hunting after all, but that was why they got a head start, to be ready for the first light. After all, elk were most active just before dawn and just after dusk. He could see off in the distance the faint hints of gray and blue, the first signs of morning, but they were so far away they offered no real light. Nate took a deep breath. The air was crisp and cool, and his breath flowed like a gentle steam on this autumn day. The wind was soft, barely rustling the leaves. Despite the utter peace of the woods around him, for some reason Nate had an uneasy feeling. He was looking around through his binoculars now, but he saw nothing but the still woods around him, still decorated by the dark shapes of the leaves in the remaining moonlight. He thought he heard a faint rumble in the distance, almost like lightning, but... "Do you think we'll finally get one today?" Troy's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. He wasn't speaking very loudly, but it was clear enough to startle him. Troy seemed to notice his reaction. "Getting too into the zone, I take it?" he said, snickering. "Oh geez, look at the master hunter over here," he said, scrunching his face like he was concentrating. "At least when I'm thinking hard, I don't look like the caveman from the Geico commercials," Nate said, making his own face back to him. Troy laughed, probably a little too loud for what the brothers were doing, but he wasn't going to be stopped by Nate. The brothers had a strong bond, and Troy had recently confessed to Nate that his high school sweetheart had left him, too overwhelmed with the stress of college herself. Their relationship had been further strained by them going to different schools, and in the end, they had lasted 2 years in college before they broke up earlier this summer. The two of them had been dating since the time they were both 15, and naturally, Troy was devastated, but he had devoted himself to school and used more of his free time joining Nate on his hunting and fishing trips or staying home and getting drunk with his friends. Nate was all too happy to welcome his brother into his hunting trips, as the company was always pleasant. Nate reached into his pack and pulled out some beef jerky, handing over a few pieces to Troy. They ate in further silence before Troy pulled a Red Bull out of his own pack, the cans popping, making a surprisingly loud sound through the trees. "Troy, man, come on, careful with the noise. We've already been a little too loud. And seriously, it's not even 5:30 yet and you're drinking a Red Bull?" Nate had one of his eyebrows raised as he turned towards his brother. Troy just kind of chuckled softly, his thick hunting clothes moving with him. "Sorry about the noise, but it wasn't that loud. And hey man, don't judge me. Some people drink coffee in the morning. I, personally, need a little more kick, especially since we're getting up before the sun is even out." Troy gestured vaguely at the darkness around them. Nate chuckled to himself and shrugged, and turned back to look around. He pulled up his binoculars again, looking for any signs of life. He knew elk would be out and about during this time. It was just a matter of finding one. Time seemed to pass slowly, and his gaze eventually led him back to the campfire, still small even in the gaze of his binoculars. They were at least a couple miles away, not close enough to distinguish anything besides a shadow that passed in front of the fire. It looked like someone was walking around, but he couldn't quite be sure. Suddenly, however, he heard fluttering, and the birds that had been roosting in the trees near the fire took to the skies. Hey Troy, you seeing this? When Troy didn't answer, Nate put down his binoculars to see that he was indeed, and watched as a blanket of birds of all types took to the skies a couple miles away. There were so many of them that all he could see was the faint shadowy mass as they flocked together in the dark light of the morning. There was no real light yet, but beyond the mountains the first of it had begun to seep into the sky like a bright river splitting a dark ocean, and the birds pooled like fish rushing towards a stream. Alright, Master Hunter, what was that? Is that normal? Troy was unsettled by what he had seen, and he had a feeling that it wasn't actually normal. Troy suddenly longed for the loud noise of campus rather than the eerie silence of the woods. If I'm being honest, I have no idea. It looks like something spooked them, but I don't see what could. Troy didn't like that answer. You think someone shot their gun? Nate considered that for a moment. No, I don't really think someone did. From where those birds are, we probably would have heard the gunshot, but I'm not sure. I've never really seen them do that before. He checked his watch, 5:47. Sunrise wasn't for about another hour or two, and the birds usually woke up about an hour before sunrise. Nate was curious. He looked through his binocs again, glancing up into the sky. The birds had begun to disperse by now, only a few of them still in his sights, finding new refuges among the trees in the distance. Still looking around, he went back to where the birds first took flight and paused. The fire was gone. Nate looked all around the area and even pulled the binoculars away from his face, but no matter where he looked, the fire was simply gone. It was still too dark to see anything solid, and all he could make out were the tops of the trees where he thought he had seen the fire shaking in the wind, but still, he saw nothing else. Nate was more uneasy now. There was no rain, and even from this distance, the fire had been far too bright to have been snuffed out that quickly. Yet, now, everywhere he looked, it was simply gone. He kept looking for another few minutes, hoping to find any sign, even smoke rising in the air. But nothing. The wind was still blowing gently, and the cool air made him feel a little more relaxed. The wind was blowing towards them, which was a good sign for their hunt, but something about the wind was also unsettling him, and he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He was still trying to figure it out, and looked through his binoculars again, watching the trees where the fire had been continue to rustle, and that's when it hit him. He put down his binoculars and looked at the tree that the brothers were sitting in. The wind was blowing all right, but none of the trees around them or the one they were in were rustling as wildly as the ones in the distance. He was about to look again when the cow call sounded next to him, startling him once again and nearly causing him to drop his binoculars. Jesus goddamn Christ, Troy, a little warning next time would be appreciated. Nate snapped at his brother, but he didn't even realize until this moment that his heart was racing. Something felt extremely off. My bad, Nate. Are you okay? I didn't mean to scare you. I just thought this might help bring him in. Troy seemed to have genuine concern in his voice, and Nate calmed down a bit and nodded. Yeah, listen, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap on you. I've got a bad feeling about something, and I don't know what. Troy paused and frowned. The brothers trusted each other, and he knew not just anything would make Nate uncomfortable. Well, hey, do we need to pack it in? I don't mind going home early, though it'll kinda suck to not get my bowl. Nate considered it for just a moment. You know, maybe. It might not be such a bad idea. Nate looked over at his rifle uneasily. He didn't know why, but some instinct in him told him to grab the gun, and so he did. Still loaded, safety on. Nate glanced down on his watch again, just after 6. Well, what do you want to do? This is your hunt. We can wait until dawn if you want. It's Saturday, so if we pack up immediately after dawn, we can be home before dark. Troy thought about it for a moment, considering his brother's words. Well, what made you uneasy? Was it the birds? Nate nodded his head yes, and then looked through his binoculars again, and Troy took out his own as well, following his brother's gaze. It's not just the birds, though. Did you see the campfire earlier at all? Yeah, I did. Why? It's gone now, and fires just don't go out that quickly. I looked away for like less than a minute. Unless that guy put a dome over his fire, it just doesn't make any sense why there's no trace of it. The pair of them continued to look, and Nate turned his attention towards the trees. They were no longer rustling, at least not any more than the ones around them. Those trees, before you used the call, I swear they were shaking. Shaking? What do you mean, like the wind? No. Shaking like something was making them shake. The brothers grew quiet and silence grew between them, and Nate's uneasiness was growing. What made the trees shake, and why weren't they shaking now? There was a sinking feeling in his gut that something was genuinely wrong. Well, maybe those other guys were hunters. The shaking could have been them getting in their own tree stand. Nate considered Troy's proposal for a moment before he spoke. It could be, but that would make maybe a couple trees shake. I swear there was more than just one tree moving. And that still doesn't explain the fire. I don't know many folks who can snuff a large fire like that out quickly, unless they had a pile of dirt or sand just waiting to fall into it. Nate put down his binoculars again and checked his rifle. It was still loaded, the safety still on. He set the rifle next to him and stood up now, trying to see as far out as he could. Still, he saw nothing but the still and quiet night. He grabbed his binoculars again, and now Troy was standing and looking too, but all the pair could see was trees, grass, and fading moonlight. After a few minutes, Nate was just about ready to say they should leave when he saw it. It was a massive bull elk, silhouetted in the darkness, walking along the edge of the forest to the west of where they had seen the tree shake, but much closer. He could see other elk too, moving away from them among the trees, but this bull was just exposed enough. This was it, what they were here for. "Troy, we got one!" Troy was alert and looked more terrified than prepared, but once he understood what was going on, he seemed to perk up a bit. "Grab your rifle, try to pick him out." He knew Troy wouldn't understand if he tried to give him the real direction of the creature, so he simply pointed, but this bull was big enough that Troy didn't need that much direction, and exposed enough that they could clearly see it. One of the biggest elk that Nate had ever seen, as far as he could tell, with a glorious pair of antlers to coincide. "Remember, try to shoot it just behind the shoulders. Its heart and lungs are there, but its heart is a little lower than you would expect. Almost like you're aiming for his armpit." Troy aimed carefully, and all the thoughts of unease had vanished from the brothers' minds when the bull appeared, even if it did tug at the back of Nate's. The elk faced slightly away from them, giving Troy a prime opportunity, and after all, he was an excellent shot. He fired once, and the gunshot rang throughout the woods, echoing around and causing the birds around them to take flight. Troy had already begun to rechamber his bolt and was aiming again. He had hit the bull, but despite that, the bull began running across the field almost towards them. He could see the wound in its side, and it looked like Troy had managed to hit the lung. Taking a deep breath, Troy fired again, and this second shot hit near the first mark as well. The elk kept running, and Nate held up his hand to tell Troy to stop, even as he rechambered once again. "Don't waste the ammo, just look." Nate pointed at the elk, which was still running indeed, but it had slowed dramatically. He could tell Troy's shots had hit something vital, and it wouldn't last much longer. Its long and low call filled the forest, echoing more than the gunshot, and it was then he heard it again. Sending a chill down his spine, he heard a deep, low, rumbling noise somewhere in the forest. Where the noise had come from, he couldn't tell, but it was definitely not lightning. Nate looked all around him, trying to find the direction of the noise, but it was already gone. He felt like he was losing his mind. Despite their victory, something still definitely felt off. Troy's worries, on the other hand, had seemed to vanish as the elk made one last call, then collapsed in the field, still in their sights about 150 yards away. He cheered, louder than Nate would have liked. "Hell yeah, we got one, Nate. That's what I'm talking about." He said it with all the excitement of a college kid, and Nate couldn't help but smile. He glanced over towards the elk, and the sky was just now turning more blue in the distance, and he knew it wouldn't be long before the blue hour hit them. Blue hour would give them plenty of light to get their camp packed up, and then go out there to dress the elk before they left. He glanced at his watch again, surprised that it was nearly 6:30. It felt like a lot less. Nate picked up his rifle and began to pack his things, but then he felt something that caused him to pause completely, and a smell filled his nostrils that made his blood run cold. "Troy." Nate said his brother's name quietly and uneasily. Troy stopped his cheering and looked at his brother, and Nate felt a slight, warm breeze on his back, and the smell was like rotting meat. But the cold wind was still blowing towards them, smelling like the comfort of a nice fall day. When it mixed with the rotten meat smell, it became sickly sweet, like it had been corrupted. He slowly turned around, and he could barely believe what he saw. Troy followed his brother's gaze, and both of their eyes grew wide as they stared at the head of a massive animal, its features half hidden in the darkness. Its nose was the source of the warm breeze, and the top of its head was level with their stand. It had enormous eyes which glowed in the dim light like the embers of a fire itself. It had pebbled skin textured like stones, and it was close enough that he could make out what seemed like tiny hairs running along its skin. It began to make that rumbling noise he had heard earlier once again, and as it did, its jaws opened, revealing enormous teeth inside the massive maw. He could smell the animal, the odor of decay clinging to it. It was a predator, and it was standing level with the tree stand. It looked at Nate as if it was contemplating, and time seemed to freeze. Nate's heart was in his throat. It was a dinosaur. A real dinosaur. This thing was enormous, and yet he hadn't even heard it approach. It was like it had just materialized out of nowhere. His fingers trembled on the top of his rifle, and he could feel the beads of sweat on his forehead as the dinosaur's enormous head let out a low and powerful rumble that shook the brothers to their bones. Those enormous jaws parted once again, and the head rushed forward. Nate found himself pulled back as his brother grabbed him and dove out of the way. Those enormous jaws snapped shut where Nate was standing just moments before, shattering and splintering the wood. The brothers scrambled to their feet as the animal's call reverberated through the trees. This wasn't like the dinosaurs in the movies. This wasn't a roar like a lion's. He could feel this rumble, and it shook his whole body. "The ladder!" Nate screamed, and both brothers bolted towards it. The dinosaur had gotten its mouth full of splintered wood, and it scraped its jaws along the tree as if to clear them away. Its head slammed against the tree, nearly pitching Troy over before Nate grabbed him by the collar. They abandoned everything but the rifles in their panic, and as they reached the ladder, the dinosaur was ready again. Its jaws snapped towards them, closing around the tree as the brothers just managed to duck out of the way. The wood was already crunching and cracking in its massive jaws. Troy had made it to the ladder first, grabbing either side with his gloved hands and letting himself slide most of the way down. As Nate began to do the same, the dinosaur shifted its whole body, causing the whole tree to lean with it and forcing Nate to fall the remainder of the way out of the tree. He landed with a hard thud on the ground, accompanied by a loud crunching noise, and he knew he had broken something in his leg. As he screamed in pain, the dinosaur snapped its jaws together, crunching through the remainder of the tree, and the top half creaking and cracking as it fell over from the animal's force, taking the remnants of their stand with it. Troy hadn't realized what was going on, and he had already made it to the truck, opening the back door, but had looked back just in time to see Nate struggling to stand. Cursing, he unshouldered his rifle and ran over to his brother, adrenaline coursing through him. Nate glanced up as the dinosaur shook its massive head, wood chunks flying everywhere, and for the first time, he saw its arms. The arms were small in comparison to the rest of its body, with just 2 fingers on top, a real Tyrannosaurus Rex. He couldn't even fully process what he was seeing. He was too invested in his own survival. Troy reached Nate and yanked him up by the collar, pushing him towards the truck. "Run!" That was all Troy could say as this behemoth charged them again. It was surprisingly fast, closing the distance on the brothers in what felt like seconds. Troy shoved Nate out of the way and dove just as he glanced back and saw the massive jaws snap shut on the ground where they were just a moment before. But it wasn't over. Even as Troy stood, the Rex pivoted on its feet, its whole body shifting towards him surprisingly fast. He stuck his rifle forward and fired as the jaws rushed toward him again. He hit his mark and the Rex snapped its mouth shut in response, clearly at least annoyed by the bullet. Its teeth snapped around the barrel of Troy's gun and he simply let it go. He wasn't about to play tug-of-war with a damn dinosaur. The Rex shook its head, grunting in pain, and Troy saw Nate doing his best to crawl and hobble his way to the truck. The Rex stomped around their campsite, demolishing their tents and what supplies they had brought, shaking its head as if to dislodge the bullet now in its neck. Troy bolted to his brother's side, lifting him up and carrying him before shoving him in the backseat of the truck. "Keys!" he shouted as he stuffed his brother into the backseat, but Nate's eyes began to grow dark. They're in my pack." Nate was grunting through the pain, but he pointed towards the pack on the opposite side of the camp where it had fallen when the Rex destroyed the stand. By now, the Rex was already turning its attention back on them, however. "You don't keep a spare?" Troy quickly opened the door and dove into the front seat, slamming the door shut as the Rex charged again. Nate didn't answer him, but crawled to the other side of the truck with Troy as the Rex slammed into their vehicle, its massive head denting the side as it sent the brothers rolling away. Luckily for them, the car landed right side up. As the brothers began to recover, the Rex rumbled again, but it didn't charge this time. Instead, it cocked its head, staring at the car. Troy sat upright and Nate did the same, managing to lift his rifle up. "Troy, I can't walk, but I can shoot. Maybe I can keep it distracted while you go for the keys?" Nate's suggestion was hopeful, but Troy didn't like the idea. Either the Rex would be focused on him or the truck, and he wasn't sure either was the smart play. The dinosaur's low rumbling had begun again, and though it was different this time, almost a slightly higher pitch. "Let's just see what it does," Troy suggested. Nate looked at him like he was an idiot, but he continued. "You were telling me about the predators, right? If it's not worth the meal, they might not go for it unless they're desperate. That's why you can bluff with the black bears, right?" At that, Nate's eyes opened wide. "Wait, Troy, you're a genius. Even if it does attack again, we might have another option. I have one in my pack, but I always kept a spare of this at least, even if not a key." Nate pointed at the glove compartment, and Troy opened it to find a mysterious can. He turned it around in his hands, eventually finding a label showing a bear on it. "It's called bear spray." And how is bear spray gonna help us? Well, bear spray is basically extra strong pepper. Nate cut himself off and stopped talking as the Rex began walking towards them. Troy expected such a giant animal to shake the ground when it walked, but it didn't. The animal moved almost silently, barely noticeable if it wasn't such a massive size. The blue hour had begun by now, giving the Tyrannosaur a haunting blue and black color as it approached them. Troy stared wide-eyed as Nate began to roll his window down using the handle as it was an older truck. He stuck his hand in the front seat and Troy handed him the can, never taking his eye off the dinosaur as it reached the car, lowering its head down. Its eye came level with the window and Troy could see its jaw hit the ground below. He could hear the animal sniffing the air deeply, staring directly at them as if into their souls. The eye moved from Troy's window, sliding back towards Nate. Nate popped the orange tab off the top of the can, aiming it out the window as the giant yellow eye slid back and began to stare directly at him. Nate sprayed, holding down the button on the can, and the reaction was almost immediate. Rumbling in anger and pain, the Rex reared its head backwards, sideswiping the car in the process and causing Nate to almost drop the can, but it was empty now. Troy did not hesitate and immediately bolted from the car, running straight for Nate's backpack. Nate didn't even have time to react, but he began to as fast as he could, pulling his rifle up and rolling his window down a little bit more. He glanced up at the dinosaur, and the Rex appeared to be throwing a tantrum, shaking its head back and forth and making odd snorting sounds. Nate was shocked. It was rubbing its snout into the ground, and the eye he sprayed was closed. It sounded almost like it was congested. It sounded like it was continually trying to take in deep breaths, but every time it grunted and rumbled, the pain was evident. The bear mace had worked surprisingly well. Nate looked back towards his brother, who had simply grabbed the entire backpack and was already bolting back to the truck. But he saw something else too. Emerging from the woods behind Troy were two miniature versions of the monster in front of him. They moved like the shadows, and Nate began to aim at them instead. They were gaining on Troy, that much he knew. "Troy, run faster! Come on!" Nate shouted as he attempted to fire his first shot, but no bullet fired, and he realized he hadn't taken off the safety. Cursing, he switched it off and aimed again, as one was now less than 25 feet from Troy. He fired, and the small animal seemed to stop completely, as if it hit a wall, and then it began to tumble. The second kept its pursuit, but aiming and rechambering again, he fired, but missed this time. Again he rechambered, and before he could fire again, their truck was kicked, sending it sliding a few feet as the big Rex continued its tantrum. Nate aimed again, but he didn't need to. The front door of the truck was still open, and Troy reached it just in time, slamming the door shut behind him as the smaller dinosaur crashed into it. Nate shot it, but missed anything important. The pain of the bullet still sent the small animal yelping and dashing off into the woods incredibly fast. He looked back towards the Rex that he had shot, and in a panic he shouted at Troy, "Find the keys and drive!" Troy was tearing Nate's bag apart, searching desperately. Next to the now dead, what he assumed to be baby T-Rex was another adult, except this one wasn't having a tantrum. Instead, it looked directly at the pair, letting out the same guttural rumble as the other. It charged at them, and he was aiming his rifle again as he heard the truck sputter to life just barely, and Troy immediately floored it. Bolting towards the makeshift road that led them here, they just managed to avoid the Rex's jaws closing behind them. The animal let out another loud guttural rumble as the brothers began to drive off, but it did not pursue. Rather, it turned its attention towards the other Rex, and the brothers successfully left. Their ride was silent as they both caught their breath, and Nate looked at his watch again. He laughed. It was only 6:51. The whole ordeal hadn't even been more than a half hour. The sun still hadn't risen as the brothers' truck hit paved roads, and they drove like their lives depended on it.